In the year 1583, a respected English scholar named John Dee stood before Queen Elizabeth and her council with an extraordinary proposal. England should skip 10 days from the calendar. September 2nd would be followed directly by September 13th. 10 days would simply vanish. The reason: Pope Gregory XIII had just reformed the calendar, and England's astronomical tables were drifting out of alignment with the seasons. But Dee's proposal was rejected almost immediately, not because the mathematics were wrong, they were impeccable, but because accepting a papal calendar would mean admitting Rome still held authority over English timekeeping, English ritual, and by extension, English souls. The battle over when to celebrate Easter had by then raged for over 1,000 years, toppled bishops, split churches, and forced Christians to choose between mathematical precision and theological purity. How did the single most important date in Christianity become its most divisive controversy? If you're curious how a calendar argument could reshape Christian history, stay with us. This story gets deeper with every century. The stakes were never just about dates. Easter commemorates the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the foundational miracle of Christian faith, the moment death itself was defeated. Getting the date wrong meant celebrating the defining event of your religion on the wrong day, possibly alone, possibly in defiance of other Christians, possibly, and this terrified early believers, in a way that dishonored God. But determining the correct date required reconciling 3 incompatible cycles: the solar year of roughly 365¼ days, the lunar month of roughly 29½ days, and the 7-day week. The Gospels provided clues but not precision. Jesus was crucified during Passover, a Jewish festival tied to the spring full moon. He rose on the first day of the week, Sunday, so Easter had to fall on a Sunday, after the spring equinox, near the full moon. Simple in theory, maddeningly complex in practice. The earliest Christians had no unified calendar and no centralized authority to impose one. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, communities scattered across the Roman Empire celebrated the resurrection on different days using different methods. Some, particularly in Asia Minor, observed what they called Pascha on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, regardless of what day of the week it fell on. These believers, known as Quartodecimans, literally 14thers, followed the chronology they believed the Apostle John had established. To them, the precise alignment with Passover mattered more than the day of the week. Other communities, especially in Rome and Alexandria, insisted Easter must always fall on a Sunday, the day of resurrection. This wasn't merely a scheduling preference, it was a theological statement about whether Christianity should define itself in continuity with Jewish practice or as something radically new. By the mid-2nd century, this disagreement had grown heated. Around 155, Polycarp, the aged bishop of Smyrna and a man who claimed to have known the Apostle John personally, traveled to Rome to discuss the matter with Anicetus, the bishop of Rome. The meeting was cordial but resolved nothing. Each bishop agreed to continue his own tradition. But cordiality collapsed a generation later. In the 190s, Victor, the Bishop of Rome, attempted to enforce Sunday observance across all churches. He threatened to excommunicate entire communities in Asia Minor that refused to abandon Quartodeciman practice. The move was unprecedented and audacious. Victor was asserting that Rome could dictate practice to distant churches, that uniformity mattered more than local tradition, and that deviation was grounds for expulsion from the faith. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, wrote to Victor urging restraint, reminding him that diversity in practice had coexisted with unity in faith. Victor's campaign ultimately failed to eliminate Quartodeciman practice immediately, but it established a dangerous precedent. Easter could be a weapon. The deeper problem was astronomical. Even among those who agreed Easter should fall on a Sunday after the spring equinox, calculating that date required knowing when the equinox occurred and when the full moon appeared. Ancient societies used different methods. The Jewish calendar was lunar, with months beginning at the new moon and an extra month inserted periodically to keep festivals aligned with seasons. The Roman civic calendar, reformed by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, was solar, with 365 days and a leap day every 4 years. Christians needed a hybrid, a lunar calculation planted on a solar framework. Different churches developed different tables, different cycles, different rules for when to add leap days or adjust moon phases. Alexandria, with its renowned scholars and access to sophisticated astronomical knowledge, developed one system. Rome developed another. The differences were small, usually just a few days, But those few days meant Christians in different cities might celebrate the resurrection a week apart, or even a month apart, in years when the systems diverged badly. The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by Emperor Constantine, attempted to settle the matter once and for all. The council, primarily remembered for defining Christ's divine nature against Arian theology, also addressed Easter. The bishops agreed on several principles. Easter must fall on a Sunday, it must come after the spring equinox, and it must not coincide with Jewish Passover. This last point was explicit and harsh. Constantine's letter following the council declared it unbecoming that Christians should follow Jewish practice in this most sacred feast. The language reflected rising Christian anti-Judaism, a desire to define Christian identity in opposition to the faith from which it had emerged. But Nicaea did not specify a single calculation method. It endorsed the Alexandrian system as authoritative, but left enforcement mechanisms vague. Churches were expected to follow Alexandria's annual announcement of the Easter date, but distant regions often continued using their own tables, either from ignorance, defiance, or simple practicality. The Alexandrian method was ingenious but complex. It used a 19-year cycle called the Metonic cycle, after the Greek astronomer Meton, which recognized that 19 solar years equal almost exactly 235 lunar months. By tracking where you were in this cycle, you could predict the date of the Paschal full moon, the first full moon on or after the spring equinox, and then find the following Sunday. Alexandrian scholars fixed the equinox at March 21st and developed tables projecting Easter dates decades into the future. Rome eventually adopted a similar system, but with slight variations in how leap years and moon phases were calculated. These variations usually didn't matter, but every few decades they produced different Easter dates, forcing churches to choose which table to trust. In the British Isles, the situation grew even more tangled. Christianity had reached Britain during the Roman period, but when Roman legions withdrew in the early 5th century, British Christians found themselves isolated from continental developments. They continued using an older Easter calculation system, possibly one that predated Nicaea or represented an early Irish interpretation of Alexandrian methods. Meanwhile, new waves of missionaries arrived. In 597, Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, brought Roman practices to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of southern England. Irish monks, following their own traditions shaped by centuries of isolation, had already established vibrant monastic communities in the north. The two missions collided, not over core doctrine, but over Easter and related customs like the style of monastic tonsure. The differences seem trivial now. Easter might fall a week apart. Monks shaved their heads differently. But to 7th century Christians, these were markers of ecclesiastical allegiance and theological correctness. The conflict reached a crisis in Northumbria in the 650s and 6060s. King Oswiu followed Irish practice, having been educated in exile at Irish monasteries. His wife, Eanfald, followed Roman practice, having been raised in Kent, where Augustine's mission had established itself. In some years, the royal household celebrated Easter on different Sundays. While the king feasted to celebrate the resurrection, the queen was still fasting for Lent. The situation was not just awkward, it was spiritually intolerable. How could a kingdom be unified if its rulers couldn't agree on the most sacred day of the year? In 664, Oswiu convened a synod at Whitby to settle the question. Both sides presented their cases. The Irish monk Colman argued for tradition, for the practices handed down by St. Columba, and ultimately, he claimed, from St. John Wilfrid, representing the Roman position, argued for universality and the authority of St. Peter, to whom Christ had given the keys of heaven. Wilfrid's argument was less about astronomy than authority. Rome spoke for the universal church, and Peter's authority outweighed local tradition. Oswiu sided with Rome. The decision was pragmatic and political as much as theological. Uniformity with the continental church meant access to broader networks of learning, trade, and legitimacy. Colman and some Irish monks withdrew rather than submit, but the Roman Easter system gradually spread across Britain. Yet, even within the Roman system, problems festered. The Julian calendar, despite its leap year correction, was slightly too long. The true solar year is about 11 minutes shorter than 365¼ days. That small error accumulated. By the medieval period, the spring equinox was occurring around March 11th instead of March 21st. Easter calculations, still assuming the equinox fell on March 21st, were drifting away from the actual seasons. Scholars noticed. Complaints surfaced at church councils, but reforming the calendar meant admitting it had been wrong for centuries, recalculating every feast day, and coordinating change across a fractured Christendom. It was easier to ignore the drift. The problem became impossible to ignore by the 16th century. The equinox had drifted 10 full days. Easter, theoretically a spring festival, was creeping toward summer. Worse, the system for calculating the paschal moon was also accumulating errors, since the 19-year Metonic cycle wasn't perfectly accurate either. The moon's phases were drifting out of sync with the tables. In 1545, the Council of Trent acknowledged the calendar needed reform and tasked the papacy with fixing it. Decades of study followed. Astronomers and mathematicians, including the Jesuit Christopher Clavius, developed a solution: drop 10 days to realign the equinox with March 21st, and adjust the leap year system to prevent future drift. Instead of every fourth year being a leap year, century years would only be leap years if divisible by 400. So 1600 would be a leap year, but 1700, 1800, and 1900 would not. This Gregorian calendar, named for Pope Gregory XIII, who promulgated it in 1582, was astronomically superior to the Julian calendar. It would take over 3,000 years to drift a single day. But the reform arrived at the worst possible moment. Europe was torn by the Protestant Reformation. For Protestant regions, accepting a papal calendar was unthinkable. It would mean acknowledging papal authority over time itself, over the rhythm of the Christian year, over something as fundamental as when to celebrate Easter. England, as John Dee discovered, rejected the reform for over a century and a half. Protestant German states resisted. The Dutch Reformed Church refused. Sweden adopted a compromise system that satisfied no one. Orthodox churches, already separated from Rome since the Great Schism of 1054, rejected the Gregorian calendar entirely, viewing it as a Latin innovation imposed without ecumenical council approval. The result was chaos. Catholic regions celebrated Easter on one date, Protestant regions on another, sometimes the same, sometimes a week apart, occasionally more. Merchants traveling between cities had to adjust their calendars. Diplomats dated treaties differently depending on their location. The Orthodox world remained on the Julian calendar, its Easter drifting further from the Catholic and eventually Protestant dates as the centuries passed. The human cost of this division was subtle but pervasive. Families split by the Reformation celebrated the resurrection apart. Communities that had once shared the most joyous day of the Christian year now feasted separately. Each side convinced the other was wrong, each side unable to yield without betraying their understanding of truth and authority. In mixed regions, the calendar became a daily reminder of division. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians lived side by side, different communities celebrated Easter weeks apart, their calendars a permanent symbol of religious fracture. England finally adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, by which point the Julian calendar had drifted 11 days behind. The British Parliament passed the Calendar Act, and in September 1752, the day after the 2nd was the 14th. 11 days vanished. Riots allegedly broke out, with crowds demanding, "Give us our 11 days back," though historians now believe these riots were largely mythologized or exaggerated by later writers. The real resistance was quieter: confusion, resentment, the disorienting sense that time itself had been stolen. Rents and wages had to be recalculated. Birthdays shifted. The financial year in Britain still begins on April 6th, a relic of the calendar change, the old March 25th New Year plus 11 days. But Easter was now aligned with Catholic Europe. The Protestant objection had finally been overcome by the sheer inconvenience of maintaining a separate calendar in an increasingly interconnected world. The Orthodox churches held out far longer. Greece didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar for civil purposes until 1923. Russia adopted it after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, which is why the October Revolution is commemorated in November by the Gregorian calendar. But for religious purposes, most Orthodox churches continue using the Julian calendar to calculate Easter. This means Orthodox Easter usually falls 1 to 5 weeks after Western Easter, though occasionally they coincide. The continued separation isn't primarily about astronomy anymore. The Julian calendar's inaccuracy is well understood. The separation is about identity, tradition, and resistance to what is seen as unilateral Western innovation. Proposals to adopt a common Easter date have been discussed ecumenically for over a century. But they founder on the question of authority. Who decides? On what basis? By what right does one tradition yield to another? In 1923, some Orthodox churches attempted a compromise. A pan-Orthodox Congress in Constantinople proposed the revised Julian calendar, which was astronomically equivalent to the Gregorian but calculated independently, preserving Orthodox autonomy. Several churches adopted it for fixed feasts like Christmas, but most kept the old Julian calendar for Easter, creating yet another layer of division. Today, Orthodox Christians are split between Old Calendar and New Calendar churches, adding internal Orthodox calendar disputes to the ancient East-West divide. The question of Easter's date has never been purely technical. Every proposed solution carries implications about authority. If the date is set by astronomical calculation, who performs the calculation, and by what method? If it's set by tradition, whose tradition? If it's set by church authority, which church? In 1928, the British Parliament passed a law allowing Easter to be fixed to the second Sunday in April, which would eliminate the variable date and its computational complexity. The law has never been implemented because it requires agreement from other churches, which has never materialized. In 1997, the World Council of Churches proposed using the most accurate astronomical calculations, with the meridian of Jerusalem as the reference point, honoring Christianity's geographical origin. The proposal went nowhere. In 2014, Pope Francis indicated openness to a fixed Easter date if other churches agreed. They haven't. The debate has left strange artifacts. The algorithm for calculating Easter is one of the most complex date calculations in common use, requiring modular arithmetic, lookup tables, and multiple conditional rules. Computer programmers encounter it as an unexpectedly difficult problem. The formula involves dividing the year by 19, by 4, by 7, performing various additions and modulo operations, and consulting the results to find a date that can fall anywhere from March 22nd to April 25th. The complexity exists because the formula tries to approximate astronomical cycles using integer arithmetic, layering centuries of adjustments and corrections into a single calculation. It's a mathematical monument to Christianity's inability to agree. The irony is profound. Easter celebrates the resurrection, the ultimate victory, the moment Christians believed death was conquered and humanity offered salvation. It should be the most unifying day in the Christian calendar, the shared joy transcending all other differences. Instead, it became a perpetual reminder of division. Christians fought over Easter because the stakes seemed ultimate. Getting the date wrong might mean celebrating incorrectly, which might mean dishonoring God, which might mean jeopardizing salvation. But the very seriousness with which they took the question made compromise impossible. Each side believed it possessed the truth, and truth cannot negotiate. The quartodeciman controversy of the 2nd century established the pattern. Victor of Rome tried to enforce uniformity through authority. The communities of Asia Minor resisted, appealing to apostolic tradition. Neither side could prove its case definitively because the New Testament doesn't specify a calculation method. Both sides were trying to be faithful to a past that hadn't left clear instructions for this particular problem. The conflict wasn't about bad faith or stupidity. It was about the inherent difficulty of translating ancient practice into perpetual rule, of maintaining unity while respecting local tradition, of balancing authority with persuasion. Nicaea tried to resolve the question through conciliar authority, the gathered bishops representing the universal church. But even Nicaea couldn't enforce its decision everywhere. The council's authority was real but not absolute. Distant churches could ignore it, either because they never received the message, or because they disagreed with its reasoning, or because local tradition felt more authoritative than distant decree. The British and Irish churches continued their own practices for centuries after Nicaea, not in deliberate defiance, but because they were geographically and institutionally separated from the Mediterranean world where Nicaea's decisions were implemented. The Synod of Whitby in 664 showed how Easter could become entangled with politics and identity. Oswey's decision for Roman practice wasn't purely theological. It was about aligning Northumbria with the broader European world, about choosing cosmopolitanism over insularity, about pragmatic advantage as much as doctrinal correctness. The Irish monks who withdrew weren't wrong in their calculations. Their system was legitimate, rooted in respectable tradition. But they lost because they couldn't offer what Rome offered: connection to a universal institution, access to broader intellectual and material resources, and the prestige of St. Peter's authority. Easter became a proxy for larger questions about who belonged to what network, whose authority mattered, what kind of Christianity would dominate. The Gregorian calendar reform of 1582 should have been a triumph of science over error, reason over tradition. The mathematics were sound, the improvement real. But it failed to unite Christianity because it was promulgated by papal authority at the very moment when papal authority was most contested. Protestant Europe couldn't accept it without conceding the Reformation's central claim that Rome had forfeited its right to universal obedience. The Orthodox world couldn't accept it without conceding that the Western Church could unilaterally reform practices that properly required ecumenical consensus. So the better calendar was rejected, and Christians continued celebrating Easter on different dates, not because anyone preferred inaccuracy, but because accuracy mattered less than autonomy. The calendar wars reveal something uncomfortable about religious history. Disputes that seem trivial to outsiders, a few days difference, a calculation method, the date of a festival, can become existential to insiders because they encode deeper questions about authority, identity, and truth. The Easter controversy was never just about dates. It was about whether Rome could command obedience, whether tradition outweighed universality, whether scientific accuracy mattered more than theological continuity, whether unity required uniformity or could tolerate diversity. These questions have no purely technical answers. They're questions about power, about who gets to decide, about whether Christianity is fundamentally one thing that must be enforced, or many things that can coexist. The human tragedy is that all sides were trying to honor the same event. Quartodecimans and Sunday observers both wanted to commemorate the resurrection faithfully. Irish monks and Roman missionaries both sought to celebrate Easter correctly. Catholic and Protestant astronomers both recognized the calendar's inaccuracy. Orthodox and Catholic churches both treasure Easter as the feast of feasts, but they couldn't agree on how to honor it together, and the very importance they attached to getting it right made compromise feel like betrayal. The controversy also reveals the limits of rationality in human affairs. The Gregorian calendar is objectively more accurate than the Julian. This isn't a matter of opinion. The astronomical facts are clear, the mathematics verifiable. Yet most Orthodox churches still use the Julian calendar for Easter, and they do so knowingly, fully aware of its inaccuracy, because other values, tradition, autonomy, resistance to Western dominance matter more than astronomical precision. This isn't irrationality, it's a different rationality, one that weighs continuity and identity alongside accuracy. From this perspective, maintaining the Julian calendar is rational because it preserves connection to centuries of practice, because it resists the implication that the Western Church has the right to dictate terms, because it values stability over optimization. The Easter controversy is quieted in recent centuries, not because it was solved, but because it became less urgent. Secularization reduced the stakes. In societies where fewer people attend church regularly, whether Easter falls on different dates matters less. Ecumenism created spaces for dialogue without requiring resolution. Christians can acknowledge their divisions without demanding immediate unity. The World Council of Churches and various bilateral dialogues have discussed the Easter question repeatedly, always concluding that agreement would be desirable but never achieving it. The conversations are cordial, the obstacles clear, the will to overcome them insufficient. Yet the division persists as a scandal in the technical theological sense, a stumbling block, an obstacle to belief. How can Christianity claim to offer truth and unity when Christians can't agree on when to celebrate their defining event? The question troubles believers more than skeptics. For skeptics, the Easter controversy is simply more evidence that religion is human invention, that theological disputes are really about power and tribalism dressed in pious language. For believers, especially those committed to ecumenism, the division is painful. It suggests that human sinfulness, pride, and tribalism can corrupt even the holiest things, that the resurrection's power to unite has been thwarted by the very people who claim to proclaim it. Some theologians have tried to reframe the division positively, arguing that different Easter dates allow Christians to extend the celebration, that the weeks between Western and Orthodox Easter can be a season of ecumenical prayer, that diversity in practice can coexist with unity in faith. These are generous interpretations, attempts to find meaning in division rather than simply lamenting it, but they can't entirely erase the sense of failure. The recognition that Christians fought over Easter because they couldn't trust each other enough to compromise. couldn't agree on whose authority to accept, couldn't separate the essential from the negotiable. The technical complexity of Easter calculation has also become a kind of fossil record of the controversy. Every rule in the algorithm, every exception and adjustment, represents a historical moment when someone decided this was how it should be done. The 19-year cycle reflects ancient Greek astronomy adopted by Alexandrian Christians. The insistence on Sunday reflects the early church's break from quartodeciman practice. The fixed equinox date reflects Nicaea's compromise. The Gregorian leap year rule reflects 16th century astronomical knowledge and papal authority. The algorithm is a palimpsest, layers of decisions and disputes compressed into a formula that most people now use without understanding its history. In the 21st century, the Easter question has become almost quaint, a historical curiosity rather than a live controversy. Proposals for a fixed Easter date surface occasionally, usually framed in secular terms about economic efficiency. A fixed date would simplify school schedules, business planning, and tourism. These proposals generally ignore or minimize the theological dimensions that made the question so fraught for so long. They assume the problem is technical and the solution obvious, not recognizing that the technical problem was always a proxy for deeper conflicts about authority and identity. The Orthodox churches that maintain the Julian calendar for Easter aren't being stubborn or irrational by modern secular standards. They're preserving a connection to their past, maintaining a distinctive identity, and resisting what they see as Western cultural imperialism. The fact that their calendar is astronomically inaccurate matters less to them than the fact that it's theirs, that it links them to centuries of saints and martyrs who used the same calendar, that changing it would feel like a capitulation. This is a perfectly coherent position, even if it perpetuates division. Western Christians who occasionally propose a fixed Easter date often don't fully grasp what they're asking. A fixed date would require abandoning the lunar calculation entirely, severing Easter's connection to Passover and to the ancient Jewish calendar. It would mean admitting that convenience matters more than tradition, that modern efficiency trumps ancient practice. Some Christians would welcome this, viewing it as a pragmatic adaptation. Others would see it as a profound loss, another step in Christianity's accommodation to secular modernity. The disagreement isn't primarily about astronomy, it's about what Christianity is and how it should relate to its past. The Easter controversy also illuminates the nature of religious authority. Christianity has never had a single, universally recognized authority structure. The papacy claims universal jurisdiction, but Protestants and Orthodox reject that claim. Ecumenical councils claim to speak for the whole church, but which councils count as truly ecumenical is itself disputed. Scripture claims ultimate authority, but Scripture doesn't specify how to calculate Easter. Tradition claims authority, but different communities have different traditions. In the absence of agreed authority, disputes become interminable. Each side can appeal to a different authority source, and no neutral arbiter exists to adjudicate between them. This is why the Easter question has never been definitively resolved. Resolution would require either one side imposing its will on others, which Victor of Rome attempted and failed to do in the 2nd century, and which no one has successfully done since, or all sides agreeing to submit to a common authority, which would require resolving the deeper question of what that authority should be. The Easter controversy can't be solved without solving the problem of Christian disunity itself. And Christian disunity can't be solved because the divisions run too deep, the history's too painful, the identity's too entrenched. Yet the controversy also reveals unexpected resilience. Christians have celebrated Easter on different dates for most of Christian history, and Christianity has survived. The division has been painful, scandalous, and counterproductive, but not fatal. Churches that celebrate Easter a week or a month apart still recognize each other as Christian, still share core beliefs about the resurrection, still read the same Gospels. The Easter controversy has been a perpetual irritant, not a mortal wound. This suggests that unity doesn't require uniformity, that Christians can disagree about significant matters while remaining in some sense one body. Whether this is a comforting thought or a damning admission depends on one's ecclesiology. The story of the Easter controversy is ultimately a story about the difficulty of translating divine truth into human practice. Christians agree that Christ rose from the dead. They disagree about how to commemorate that event because commemoration requires choices about calendars, calculations, authority, and tradition, and humans make different choices. The resurrection is a singular event, but its celebration is plural, fractured, contested. This gap between the unity of the event and the diversity of its observance has troubled Christians for 2 millennia. It will likely trouble them for millennia more, because the underlying tensions between authority and freedom, tradition and innovation, local and universal, East and West, are built into Christianity's structure. The battle over Easter reveals that the holiest things are often the most fought over, not despite their holiness, but because of it. When something matters deeply, disagreement becomes intolerable. When eternal stakes are involved, compromise feels like betrayal. The Easter controversy is a case study in how religious devotion can produce division, how the attempt to honor God correctly can lead to conflict with fellow believers, how the quest for truth can fracture community. These are uncomfortable lessons, but they're woven through Christian history. The Easter controversy isn't an aberration, it's a pattern. Perhaps the deepest irony is that Easter celebrates victory over death, the promise of resurrection, the hope of ultimate reconciliation. Yet Christians have never managed to celebrate it together. The day that should symbolize unity has become a perpetual reminder of division. The feast that proclaims death defeated has been scarred by centuries of conflict. This doesn't negate Easter's meaning for believers, but it complicates it, adds a note of sorrow to the joy, reminds Christians that the resurrection's full implications remain unrealized in history. The kingdom has come, but not yet fully. Death is defeated, but Christians still die. Unity is promised, but Christians remain divided. Easter celebrates what God has done, but the Easter controversy reveals what humans have failed to do. That tension between divine promise and human failure, between the ideal and the real, between the resurrection's power and the church's weakness, runs through the entire history of Christianity. The battle over Easter is just one place where it becomes visible. If the inability to agree on Easter's date tells us anything, it's that even the most sacred truths must pass through human hands. And human hands always leave fingerprints. The resurrection is divine, but the calendar is human. The miracle is eternal, but its commemoration is temporal. And in that gap between the eternal and the temporal, between what God has done and what humans must decide, lies the space where the Easter controversy has lived for 2,000 years. It's a space of genuine difficulty, of competing goods, of impossible choices. And it's a space where Christians, for all their disagreements, have at least been united in one thing: the conviction that Easter matters too much to get wrong, even if they've never agreed on what getting it right would mean. What do you think matters more? Celebrating Easter on the astronomically correct date, or celebrating it in continuity with your tradition? If this deep dive into Christianity's most enduring controversy intrigued you, consider subscribing for more stories where faith, power, and human nature collide in unexpected ways. The calendar wars produced casualties that history has largely forgotten. In the 17th century, a German Lutheran pastor named Michael Maestlin found himself in an impossible position. Maestlin was a talented astronomer who had taught Johannes Kepler and understood perfectly well that the Gregorian calendar was more accurate than the Julian. He published astronomical tables that used Gregorian calculations internally because they produced better results. But publicly, he had to defend the Julian calendar because his church and his prince demanded it. To accept the Gregorian reform would be to accept papal authority, which for a Lutheran was theologically impossible. Maestlin spent years writing treatises that acknowledged the Gregorian calendar's astronomical superiority while arguing that Protestants should reject it anyway. His work is painful to read. A brilliant mind forced to subordinate scientific truth to theological politics. A man who knew the right answer but couldn't say it aloud without endangering his career and his community. Maestlin wasn't alone. Across Protestant Europe, astronomers and mathematicians faced the same dilemma. They could see that the calendar was wrong, that the equinox had drifted, that the Easter calculation was accumulating errors. But they couldn't fix it without appearing to submit to Rome. Some, like Maestlin, tried to develop Protestant alternatives, modified calendars that would achieve the same astronomical accuracy as the Gregorian reform, but through different calculations, allowing Protestants to be right without being Catholic. These efforts failed, not because the mathematics were impossible, but because the political will didn't exist. Princes and church leaders weren't interested in subtle distinctions between calendars that achieved the same result through different formulas. They wanted visible difference from Catholic practice, even if that difference meant being wrong. The cost of this stubbornness was measured in more than astronomical accuracy. Trade suffered. A merchant traveling from Protestant Hamburg to Catholic Cologne in the early 17th century had to adjust not just his watch but his calendar. Contracts had to specify which calendar was being used. Ships arriving in port might find themselves 10 days early or late depending on how the captain had reckoned time. The Holy Roman Empire, split between Catholic and Protestant territories, became a patchwork of different dates. Some cities adopted the Gregorian calendar, others refused, and the imperial diet spent decades arguing about whether uniform timekeeping was worth the theological compromise. In Sweden, the calendar confusion reached tragicomic levels. In 1700, Sweden decided to gradually transition from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar by skipping all leap days between 1700 and 1740, which would eventually bring the Swedish calendar into alignment with the Gregorian. But the plan required coordination and consistency over 40 years. It had neither. Sweden skipped the leap day in 1700 as planned, but then got distracted by the Great Northern War. In 1704 and 1708, Sweden forgot to skip the leap days, leaving the Swedish calendar 1 day behind the Julian, but 10 days behind the Gregorian. Sweden now had its own unique calendar that matched no one else's. In 1712, the government gave up and tried to revert to the Julian calendar by adding an extra leap day, creating February 30th, 1712, a date that existed in Sweden and nowhere else in history. Finally, in 1753, Sweden abandoned this mess and adopted the Gregorian calendar properly, skipping 11 days overnight. The Swedish calendar disaster illustrates what happens when astronomical reform collides with political distraction and institutional incompetence. Russia's calendar journey was even longer and more politically charged. The Russian Orthodox Church viewed the Gregorian calendar as a Catholic innovation and therefore heretical. When Peter the Great tried to westernize Russia in the early 18th century, he reformed many things, the military, the bureaucracy, the dress code, but he didn't dare touch the church calendar. The Julian calendar remained standard in Russia for another 2 centuries. By the 20th century, Russia was 13 days behind Western Europe. Russian athletes arriving for the 1908 Olympics in London showed up 12 days late because they'd calculated travel time using the Julian calendar. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they saw calendar reform as part of their broader assault on traditional authority. In February 1918, the Soviet government decreed that January 31st would be followed by February 14th. 13 days vanished. The Orthodox Church refused to recognize the change for religious purposes, creating a split between civil and religious time that persists in Russia today. The state celebrates New Year on January 1st, but many Orthodox Russians also celebrate Old New Year on January 14th, the date that would be January 1st on the Julian calendar. The calendar has become a marker of identity. Secular versus religious, modern versus traditional, Soviet versus Orthodox. The Orthodox world's relationship with the calendar is complicated by factors beyond simple conservatism. For Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule, maintaining the Julian calendar was an act of resistance against both Catholic and Muslim dominance. The Ottoman Empire used an Islamic lunar calendar for religious purposes and various solar calendars for administrative purposes, but it allowed Christian minorities to maintain their own timekeeping. The Julian calendar became a symbol of Christian identity in a Muslim empire, a way of marking time that asserted continuity with Byzantine Christianity and independence from Western Catholic influence. When Greece gained independence in the 19th century and eventually adopted the Gregorian calendar for civil purposes in 1923, the Orthodox Church of Greece initially resisted, viewing the change as Western cultural imperialism. The compromise, Gregorian calendar for civil dates, Julian for Easter, satisfied almost no one but proved durable. The Armenian Apostolic Church, one of the oldest Christian communities, has its own unique position in the calendar wars. Armenians celebrate Christmas on January 6th rather than December 25th, preserving an ancient practice that predates the 4th century separation of Christmas and Epiphany. For Easter, the Armenian Church uses a calculation method that usually aligns with the Eastern Orthodox date, but occasionally differs. This triple division, Western Easter, Eastern Orthodox Easter, and occasionally Armenian Easter, means that in some years, Christians celebrate the resurrection on 3 different Sundays. The Armenian practice isn't a miscalculation or a mistake. It's a deliberate preservation of ancient tradition, a way of maintaining identity for a people who have survived centuries of persecution and genocide, partly by maintaining cultural and religious distinctiveness. The Easter controversy has also produced unexpected theological creativity. Some Christian thinkers have argued that the variable date of Easter is actually spiritually meaningful. Unlike Christmas, which is fixed to December 25th, Easter moves through the spring, falling sometimes in March, sometimes in April, early some years and late others. This variability, they argue, reflects the resurrection's disruptive power, its refusal to be domesticated or controlled. Easter won't stay in one place. It breaks through our attempts to pin it down, just as the resurrection broke through death's attempt to contain Jesus. This is beautiful theology, but it's also a rationalization of failure. Christians didn't choose a variable Easter date for theological reasons. They inherited a complex calculation from Jewish Passover observance and then spent centuries fighting about how to perform it. The theological meaning was discovered after the fact, a way of making necessity into virtue. Other theologians have argued the opposite, that Easter should be fixed to a single Sunday, perhaps the second Sunday in April, to emphasize the resurrection's stability and reliability. God's victory over death isn't variable or uncertain. It happened once, definitively, and its commemoration should reflect that certainty. A fixed date would also eliminate the computational complexity that has caused so much confusion and division. This argument has appealed to pragmatists and modernizers, but it has made little headway among traditionalists who view the lunar calculation as part of Easter's essential character, a link to the Jewish roots of Christianity that shouldn't be severed for convenience. The ecumenical movement of the 20th century raised hopes that the Easter question might finally be resolved. In 1963, the Second Vatican Council opened the Catholic Church to calendar reform, stating that the Church would not object to fixing Easter to a particular Sunday if other Christian communities agreed. This was a significant concession. The Catholic Church was offering to abandon its traditional calculation method, if doing so would promote Christian unity. But the offer required reciprocal agreement from Orthodox and Protestant churches, which never materialized. The Orthodox churches were divided among themselves, with some open to discussion and others adamantly opposed to any change. Protestant churches, having finally adopted the Gregorian calendar after centuries of resistance, saw no reason to change again. The ecumenical moment passed without resolution. In 1997, a consultation in Aleppo, Syria, sponsored by the World Council of Churches, proposed what seemed like an elegant solution. Instead of using historical calculation methods or fixed dates, Christians would determine Easter using the most accurate astronomical observations available, calculated from the meridian of Jerusalem. This would honor Christianity's geographical origin, use the best science available, and potentially unite all Christians behind a single method. The proposal was astronomically sound and theologically sensitive. It went nowhere. The problem wasn't technical but institutional. Who would perform the calculations? Who would announce the result? What if observatories disagreed? And most fundamentally, why should churches abandon centuries of tradition for a new system, even a better one? The Aleppo proposal revealed that the Easter question isn't really about astronomy. It's about authority, tradition, and identity, questions that can't be solved by better calculations. The persistence of the Easter controversy into the 21st century demonstrates something important about religious change. Reform is possible when it serves institutional interests or responds to overwhelming practical necessity. The Protestant adoption of the Gregorian calendar in the 18th century happened not because Protestants suddenly decided papal authority was acceptable, but because the practical costs of maintaining a separate calendar became unbearable. Russia adopted the Gregorian calendar not because the Orthodox Church changed its mind, but because the Bolsheviks imposed it by force. But reform that requires only coordination between institutions, with no overwhelming practical necessity and no force to impose it, rarely happens. The Easter question falls into this category. The current situation is awkward and symbolically troubling, but it's not practically unbearable. Christians can live with different Easter dates, even if they wish they didn't have to. The digital age has added a new dimension to the Easter question. Computer operating systems, calendar applications, and scheduling software must handle Easter's variable date. Programmers have discovered that Easter calculation is surprisingly difficult to code. The algorithm involves multiple conditional statements, modular arithmetic, and special cases. Bugs in Easter calculation code have caused software failures and scheduling errors. Microsoft Excel, one of the world's most widely used programs, includes built-in functions for calculating Easter, but the functions use different algorithms for different calendar systems, and the documentation warns users that the calculations may not match the official dates announced by religious authorities in all years. The fact that calculating Easter is a known difficult problem in computer science is a strange legacy of Christianity's ancient divisions. The Easter controversy has also influenced how Christians think about time itself. Western Christianity, shaped by Roman legal traditions and medieval scholasticism, tends to think of time as something that can and should be measured precisely, divided into exact units, and controlled through authoritative determination. Eastern Christianity, shaped by different philosophical traditions, tends to think of time more organically, as something to be inhabited rather than mastered, where approximate alignment matters more than exact precision. These different attitudes toward time reflect deeper theological differences about how God relates to creation, whether divine order is primarily rational and legal or mysterious and participatory. The Easter controversy isn't just about dates. It's about different Christian intuitions regarding order, authority, and the proper relationship between divine truth and human knowledge. Jewish observers have occasionally commented on the irony of Christians fighting over a date that derives from the Jewish calendar. Passover, the festival that provides the temporal framework for Easter, moves through the spring according to the Jewish lunar calendar without causing the kind of controversy that has plagued Christianity. Jews in different communities might observe Passover on slightly different dates due to time zone differences or disputes about when the new moon appears. But these differences don't produce the kind of institutional fractures that the Easter controversy has generated in Christianity. The difference may lie in the nature of the two faiths' authority structures. Judaism has multiple centers of authority and a long tradition of legitimate disagreement within certain boundaries. Christianity, despite its divisions, has repeatedly tried to enforce uniformity, and those attempts at enforcement have often produced the opposite of their intended effect. The Easter controversy also raises questions about what unity means. Christians have often assumed that unity requires uniformity, same beliefs, same practices, same calendar. But the Easter controversy suggests that this equation may be wrong. Christians have celebrated Easter on different dates for most of Christian history while still recognizing each other as Christian. They have maintained theological dialogue, engaged in missionary work, translated each other's texts, and occasionally cooperated despite their calendar differences. This suggests that a degree of unity can exist without uniformity, that Christians can be one in some sense while remaining many in other senses. Whether this is an acceptable form of unity or a compromise that falls short of what Christ intended is a question Christians continue to debate. Some contemporary Christians have tried to turn the Easter controversy into an opportunity for ecumenical witness. In cities with significant Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox populations, churches sometimes organize joint celebrations during the weeks between Western and Eastern Easter. These events don't resolve the calendar question, but they transform it from a scandal into an occasion for encounter. Christians who celebrate Easter on different dates can still pray together, break bread together, and witness together to the resurrection. This approach accepts division while refusing to let division have the last word. It's a modest form of reconciliation, but perhaps modest reconciliation is all that's possible, when centuries of history have created deep institutional and cultural differences. The Easter controversy has also influenced Christian attitudes toward Judaism. The insistence at Nicaea that Easter should not coincide with Passover reflected early Christian anti-Judaism, a desire to define Christian identity in opposition to Jewish practice. This attitude hardened over centuries, contributing to the marginalization and persecution of Jewish communities in Christian lands. In the 20th century, especially after the Holocaust, many Christian churches have repented of this anti-Judaism and sought to recover Christianity's Jewish roots. This theological shift has created some tension with traditional Easter calculations, which were explicitly designed to separate Christian practice from Jewish observance. Some contemporary Christians have argued for returning to a closer alignment with Passover, not to adopt Jewish practice, but to honor the historical connection between the two festivals. This proposal has made little headway institutionally, but it represents a significant shift in Christian consciousness about the relationship between the two faiths. The question of Easter's date ultimately reveals the limits of human attempts to perfectly commemorate divine action. Christians believe God raised Jesus from the dead on a particular day at a particular time in history. But that day is gone, unrepeatable, accessible only through memory and faith. Every Easter celebration is an approximation, an attempt to mark an anniversary when the exact date is uncertain and the event itself transcends ordinary time. The resurrection happened in history, but Christians believe its effects extend beyond history into eternity. How do you calculate the anniversary of an eternal event? The question may be unanswerable, and the Easter controversy may be the result of trying to answer it anyway. The battle over Easter continues, though the weapons have changed. No one is excommunicated anymore for celebrating on the wrong date. No councils convene to impose uniformity. No princes enforce calendar conformity on their subjects. But the division remains, encoded in calculation algorithms, preserved in institutional traditions maintained by inertia and identity. Every year, Christians celebrate the resurrection, and most years they celebrate it apart. The scandal persists not because anyone wants it to, but because no one has found a way to end it that doesn't require someone to surrender something they consider essential. Perhaps the Easter controversy will never be resolved. Perhaps Christians will celebrate the resurrection on different dates until Christ returns, carrying their divisions into eschatology. Or perhaps some future generation will find a way forward that current Christians cannot imagine. A solution that honors tradition while enabling unity, that respects authority while allowing freedom, that acknowledges difference while creating communion. The history of the Easter controversy offers little reason for optimism but also no grounds for despair. Christians have been fighting over Easter for 2,000 years. They've also been celebrating it for 2,000 years, proclaiming that death is defeated and life has triumphed. The celebration continues despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, a testament to both human failure and divine persistence. The resurrection happened whether Christians can agree on its date or not. That may be the most important lesson of the Easter controversy. Human divisions, however painful and however scandalous, cannot undo what God has done. The battle over Easter is real, but it's not ultimate. Christians have fought over the date, but the event itself stands beyond their arguments, inviting them to something greater than their disagreements. Whether they will accept that invitation, whether they will find a way to celebrate together what they all claim to believe, remains an open question. The answer will shape not just how Christians commemorate the past, but how they witness to the future. What does the centuries-long battle over Easter teach us about the relationship between truth and unity, between tradition and change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this journey through Christianity's most enduring calendar controversy has expanded your understanding of how faith and history intertwine, subscribe to the channel. There are more untold stories where belief, power, and human nature collide in ways that still echo today. Next time, we'll explore another moment when the sacred and the political became impossible to separate.